Okay, I think we're on.
Yep.
Woo.
So, who wants to start?
Who wants to start? Well, maybe, is it Matt or Matthew?
Matthew's good.
Matthew, okay. Maybe if you just start, if you have some questions to begin with, we can just open up with those and then see where that takes us.
Okay. Maybe I'll frame it as statements. So was it Sam Harris specifically, or moral, not objectivism, but realism that we were wanting to discuss specifically?
I think I'm a massive Sam Harris fan, so most of my philosophy is just copied from him. So
okay.
if you started with him, then that's probably a good place to start.
Okay. Well, I guess the way I would, the challenge I am most interested in hearing feedback on is, it seems to me like I was refreshing my memory on some Sam Harris before this, re-listening to some of his books at 2 times speed and that kind of thing. And the thing that I find I object to the most is not so much his arguments, which are okay. I don't exactly prescribe to him, but I don't necessarily find fatal flaws, except he has a way of, how do I say this? Harry, by any chance, did you get a chance to look at the video I linked on Mark's?
I haven't looked at that yet.
Okay,
but I will do.
I'll see if I can summarize that. So there is something I like to call social systemics. And the idea here is, so me and you and John and Mark were used to using arguments and debating these in very, very methodical ways. But there's a sense in which, how do I best say this? If I make an argument and I feel like I've won that argument, the person I'm arguing with doesn't necessarily believe that, and they don't go away. And the problem I'm trying to point out is that when we are making arguments, when we are trying to win arguments, if we are trying to win them void the opinions and thoughts and processes of the other person, we are not exactly making a connection with that person. We're not changing the world. We're just spouting off our ideals. And I believe it is vital to be able to have a productive conversation with somebody such that you understand them a little bit more and they understand you a little bit more, and you start coming together and finding common ground. My biggest objection to Sam Harris is I just don't see him doing that. And I must say, after talking with
podcasts or in his book or both, or just in general?
Honestly, it's mainly his books. His podcasts don't do this to me as much, but then he's not, he usually saves all the big gun topics for his books, and he'll go all far afield on his podcasts. And I love some of his neuroscience podcasts and some of the other stuff, all his stuff that doesn't have to do with saying, you naughty religious people, almost all of that stuff I'm fine with. But once he starts getting onto topics of religion and ethics, well, kind of morality, I kind of like some of his moral arguments. I don't find them compelling, but I find them interesting. And I think that's a good distinction, because I don't find them motivating. I don't find those to be the kinds of things that make me want to be moral. I find my experiences with the divine to be the kind of thing that makes me want to be a good person, not a good argument. So that's kind of my position, and maybe we can jump from there.
Can you just repeat that position again, just so I can just got it in my login?
So my position is that. Sorry.
That's right.
Kind of that, like, Sam Harris isn't a very good interlocutor for people that are of different kind of faiths, I guess. Or
that's a pretty good.
Actually, it was the last bit. I understood that part about kind of the way he communicates,
right?
Particularly on topics of religion, it doesn't open the dialogue but tends to close it. But it was the last bit where you said, I find it compelling but not motivating, or something. And then there was a bit about the divine that I missed that I wanted to catch again.
Okay, so I'm talking about motivation with those two arguments. So I think it's really important when we're talking about how the human race as a whole can move forward that we're not just launching these analytical argumentative volleys at each other, but that we are actually getting to know each other better, finding common ground, and developing that.
Yeah.
And that's what
Yeah.
I don't see Sam Harris doing. That, and I think it actually creates more division. Like it's hard for me to dig into Sam Harris's work when I feel like he's strawmanning at every point, and he's not being, what's the word, the
cordial, genial,
cordial,
nice, friendly.
The principle of
charity.
He does not engage in whatsoever for the most part when he's talking about religious things. And
or steel man. He doesn't steel man as often as he
well,
should.
I would say not. I don't see much steel manning in his books. I haven't heard him steel man any religious positions. And I've actually seen him say things like something like, the problem is that when I hear the good arguments, he says something like, I only address the low-lying branches with Christianity, because even when I do try to address the more substantive arguments, I don't find anything there. That's what he says. And I'm like, okay, how hard have you tried?
Well, what we come out, I think that he does. So if we completely disagree on that,
that's
point,
fine. Yeah.
Well, because I'm a massive Sam Harris fan. I think he talks actually quite openly. He has lots of guests which disagree with him, and sometimes those conversations fail because they're just too far apart. I think that he could practice his street epistemology a little bit better. But I find him very compelling and motivating in those regards, but I'm also a different audience entirely. Like, I'm part of his tribe. So, when it's easier for me to listen to his arguments because I'm nodding my head the whole time, right? I'm not trying to pick a part of it. I just agree with it. But I think that aside, because it's just an opinion about a philosopher. So we can I don't feel the need to persuade you that he is good at that. I'm happy just to let that be. But I'd be interested more about kind of touching into the kind of the ethical arguments he has, kind of the philosophies that he holds, and whether they hold any water.
Okay.
So I guess that would literally be moral realism, and the idea that there are moral objective facts. That I think that's very. And the other one that I'm happy to go through is free will as well. So he's a determinist.
Okay.
Happy to
We've had that discussion. Well, okay. Let me think. I don't feel super prepared to talk about moral realism because is it fair to say that moral realism is very parallel to arguments for objective morality, or are there nuances there that need to be pulled out?
I understand it exactly that. Is that the moral statements are statements that track into the natural world, and so you can be objectively wrong or right about those statements. So when I say something is good, that's an opinion that I have, and I could be wrong about that opinion according to the actual state of the universe. Oops, sorry. Yeah, that would be my take on it.
I would say there's a sort of distinction to be made within the moral realist camp between moral realist prescriptivists and moral realist descriptivists. So those that say there are true moral prescriptions for how we ought to behave. And then there's the other camp that there can be overlap between the two, of there are real or true moral statements regarding what are better and worse states of the universe. Like, you can purely just describe these sorts of things in a sort of factual manner without having to include any sort of component of, like, you ought to move this way instead of that way or anything like that. And I think Sam Harris...
I don't see the separation. I don't see the separation between the prescriptive and the descriptive. I think as soon as you said that description, you're automatically implying kind of the prescriptive versions of it. That would be the way that...
So that confuses me.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, because like I could consider like a sociopath who would completely agree with the descriptive components to Sam Harris's kind of arguments and say that yes, it is the case that by my murdering this person, it increases the amount of or increases the amount of suffering in the world, but that doesn't matter. And so I think there has to be some like further component to say, yeah, you ought to not increase suffering in the world. And that's the thing that actually makes the fact that it increases suffering important, because that actually changes, oh, I guess I shouldn't do this act thing.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
The way I see it is that suffering is, in its very nature, is prescriptive. It is saying that a state is bad, and therefore, by that definition, you ought to avoid it.
Okay,
so it is. It ties the two. That's the brute fact thing. That's where you come in on that level. There isn't anything lower. Kind of the way that you define, like, bad is something that you'd want to avoid, and suffering is something that you want to avoid. Those are two kind of the foundational principles.
Right. So that makes it at least sense for the individual case where like it is just a brute, it doesn't require any further like justification. The fact that putting my hand on a stove causes me pain, and there's this sort of intrinsic
and that
quality.
Pain is bad.
This intrinsic quality to it that makes me want to avoid it. But that doesn't say anything about the fact that my putting your hand on the stove, I don't feel any pain, and so there's no longer that intrinsic quality there to be experienced, at least from my point of view, to say that, oh, I ought to avoid putting your hand on the stove.
Right. It's harder to convince people of that being the case, because you have to have theory of mind. Probably you have to understand a little bit about biology as well. You have to understand what causes pain in others. And if you don't have that empathy, then that makes it very tricky. I think empathy actually, I agree with Paul Bloom in the sense that it's helpful in some regards, but actually it can be quite hindering in others and lead us to make pretty crap decisions when it comes to helping ourselves and helping others, just because our monkey minds are hardwired to survive in a small primate community, not to be part of a globalized civilization. So I think for me, the distinction is just, it's tricky to convince someone who doesn't think that that's the case, but that doesn't stop it being the case.
Right. So because there's suffering that's occurring, there is still this intrinsic element that it ought to be avoided. It's just the fact that me from my perspective, I'm not feeling that intrinsic element to it, but there is still that intrinsic element there, if from like an objective level. Okay, that makes more sense. I think what you're kind of pointing out there about the sort of limitations of human motivation is kind of getting at what Matthew mentioned at the beginning, and it's something that I think that Sam Harris has kind of pointed out in numerous times in his podcast, that like if you're shown this commercial about this one poor starving child in Africa, that really motivates you in order to give money to the starving child. But if you just increase that by 1,000, suddenly it's the case that like, okay, well, that's too much of a big deal. I can't help. I can help one person, but I can't help 1,000. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, they just added, so the case that's also in the beginning of Peter Singer's work, "The Life You Can Save." I think that's why Sam Harris quotes it. But it's a little girl, and you're supposed to give to the little girl, and you add a little brother in, and it like drops by like a quarter the amount that people are willing to give, and then you add a camp of people, and it goes to like 1/10, and then after that, people stop altogether. So if you say there's this problem, lots of people have malaria, they're dying of it, people just don't give anything. It's just an incredible. It's baffling at first to understand why the human mind thinks like that. And it's all about this kind of this social reward and the fact that we're drawn towards, again, survival in close groups. So I think that our feelings are very important in terms of our intuitions are important in kind of the groundwork, but really they need to be extended beyond that. So we have intuitions of what might cause us healthy, but that we have an objective science of medicine, because our intuitions are often poor. They can be quite good, and we can start there, but we need to extrapolate from that, found the foundational level. We've just been reading Sean Carroll's book, The Big Picture. So I like the idea of find the poetic naturalism, the kind of the defining term and story within that then helps us build an objective framework from it, just like we have done in health, or just like we've done in chemistry, or those fields have come together, they've merged into something more fundamental to make it easier to understand the world around us. And
Right.
and for me, morality fits the same category as health or these other things. We've got this problem of defining it, absolutely, and that is a problem. Everything has to go through that problem. It should be a debate about what is the foundational principle here in which for us to build upon. And it seems to me like the most sensible one is that of conscious experience, of bad conscious experiences and good conscious experiences. And I don't know why conscious experience has that valence, but it just does. We just seem to, we are comfortable and uncomfortable. It just seems to be the way that we're built.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know, at least for myself, and I think also from my discussions with Matthew, it seems that there's sort of this element of like we like things that sound good in theory are great, but I want to know that these types of things also have some sort of practicality to them, and then like
right,
how can
absolutely
they be shown to sort of work that way. And I think that there's a lot of things that we can see working in practice that are very effective, and then there's sort of these revolutionary type things to sort of take that same role and saying, and theoretically it'll be able to satisfy that role completely. That there's not exactly been shown to be the case, or at least as of yet, which is why I think there's maybe some amount of skepticism there.
So to summarize your position, you're saying you're skeptical of this idea of defining morality in this way, because obviously once we define the field, there'll always be objective facts to be had within that field. The problem here sounds like it's a problem of whether defining morality in that way is helpful or effective. Is that the...
Yeah, I think so. Like
point?
you could have that as your sort of starting axioms for like what we're going to define morality to be, and then work from there. But even within that axioms, there's still going to be these sorts of questions of like, okay, how do we utilize these axioms to their greatest effect?
Right. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Like, I think there's a bit of smuggling that Sam Harris has, in that he's both a very much hard-nosed modernist realist, and then wanting to believe things in regards to their truth value, but also for morality, he says the only thing that we should value are that which produces greater well-being in conscious creatures. And those two things can overlap to a great degree, I'm sure. But there's also instances where the promulgation of conscious experiences are had through fudginess in the stories that we tell ourselves. That I think, at least from his perspective, he'd be unwilling to sort of go along with. Just be like, I don't know, the whole new age sort of woo-woo nonsense of like power of positive psychology and all of that. Those are all elements that I think produce a certain amount of like positive experiences for people in their well-being. But it's also something that sort of contradicts sort of the more modernistic scientific worldview that we have. And so I'm just sort of curious where those two, at least from my perspective, seem to conflict with each other. How can they sort of be resolved? Yeah.
Right. I don't think they do conflict. So the way that I see it is that the reason we use logic and rationality in philosophy is because it makes our lives better. If it made it worse or didn't help us understand the world, if for some reason, I don't know, the logic didn't work, then we wouldn't use it. So the fundamental underlying principle is our lives. It's our experience. And that's the point he's trying to make.
Right.
And
so science makes us feel good, right?
Right. Yeah. So it makes our lives better. We wouldn't do science if it was excruciating to do the scientific method and none of the results worked, then we just wouldn't do it. It wouldn't be something that tracks with our reality. So it would be something we'd leave at the door. I can't imagine a reality like that. That requires a more creative person. But I don't see a conflict there. So the reason why, so I could definitely see, for instance, so I think Haidt's work shows, for instance, that if you have close-knit insular communities, which can have pretty horrific moral principles attached to them, like, for instance, they can be quite sexist, or they can have quite violent laws, but people within them can be very happy, or some people can state to be very happy within those particular communities. And so if you found that living in rural America and being Bible thumping, whatever, made your life amazing, then we need to understand what the fundamental principles of that are. I would say the fundamental principles aren't the fact that the Bible gives people that sense of security and the kind of that's what gives them the nice life. I would say there's something much deeper than that, which is the community, and we can build from that and then move from that. So the reason why, for instance, you see lots of benefits from religion is because of the community it creates and because of the certainty it gives people. And so does that have to come from certain types of religion? I don't know. I think you'd require some pretty hard social science to understand how that dynamic changes with different religions and different cults and different groups. But moral realists just say that there are objective facts to be had about if you create societies in different ways, other societies would be objectively worse than other ones. So if you set up a society that's fascist or communist compared to the societies we have today, they would say, it's a moral fact that they would be worse for people's health and well-being. They would, it wouldn't, you'd get rid of autonomy and people would be living more in fear. And so the experience of living in those societies would be objectively worse. And it's saying that we can discover those facts. It's not saying what those facts are, nor is it saying that they have those facts. So just because I'm a moral realist doesn't mean I actually know what those facts are. It just means I think that we can get at some pretty basic principles about living a good life, and they will be objectively right according to the human experience.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, Matthew, I kind of jumped in there a little bit, but if there's something that you wanted to bring up, you're welcome to.
Okay, there we go. No, that's good because like my brain was trying to seize up on me, and I'm like, no, not right now. And then John swooshed in to save the day, so it was good. So I guess some of the things that you were saying that kind of clicked alarms off for me. Again, I'm uncertain where. Okay, how should I say this? I'm going to start by conceding some ground. I am aware that as a believer in a religion, my motivational structure is something like rocket fuel. Okay, so I'm very used to having a very high level of motivation to do the right thing and become a good person and to craft myself into the most good person I can become. When I hear the arguments from objective morality with nothing else, because I could make an argument from objective morality as a Christian, but as when I hear arguments that are made from people who are more naturalistic in their tendencies, they don't see a larger story, or at least that's my perception of them in comparison to my own views. Then I'm like, what is their motivation? Because I got to tell you, I'm kind of a scumbag sometimes. I'm not always motivated to be a really good guy. And I have to watch that. And, I lose my patience with my family, and I have to remember, okay, there are eternal significances to these things. These are not just something that'll be over in the short 20, 80 years, whatever. There's more going on. And that to me is a greater motivation. Now, like I said, I'm aware that I'm used to running off of rocket fuel. And so maybe it simply looks different for someone who doesn't use that kind of fuel to motivate their morality. I would just like to hear what you think of that.
I think it's fantastic that you found that in your life, something that can give you that motivation to be a good person. That's really awesome. I think a lot of people really struggle with nihilism and a lack of value and direction. So, and I think that's something that's systematic with our species. We seem to have a limbic system attached to a cortex, and it causes a lot of issues when it comes to trying to be happy. I suppose I would take it a step back and just say, look, we've had this conscious experience. What can we make of it? What's the best way in which we can live our lives, and what's true? Those are, I would take it from those steps. And from that, I think that we need to build societies that are motivating towards the betterment of ourselves and others. So I think you picked up on an excellent point there, which is that we need to have motivating principles within a society to draw it to something that is good, and good in the standard of moving away from horrid conscious experiences like big authoritarian regimes and things like that. or sexist regimes, or whatever it may be. So something that is excessively oppressive, needlessly so. And so I think that we can find that. I think we can find purpose. I mean, I would say that because I've got lots of purpose in my life, and I don't believe in a God, and I feel very motivated, and I feel like I can generate that purpose through various other means. We just finished a book, actually, which is all about how your impermanence actually gives you purpose and reason to be, and make the most of every moment that you have, and to think about your role with yourself and with others. So I actually think that knife cuts both ways. I think both permanence and impermanence can give people motivation. I would even argue that impermanence gives people more motivation, but I don't really want to go around down that rabbit hole. But there's something there at least. So I think that we should look for motivation. And look, if we find out that Christianity is the best way to construct society in the stories and in the narrative, and I know there's many different flavors of Christianity, or many different flavors of believing in a God. But if we find out that that is some kind of principle which is necessary for a better society, moral realism will find that out through the scientific method. You'll compare societies and religions, find the ones which make people happier, and report that as data, and discuss it, and try and understand the foundational principles why that be. I suspect that the foundational principles why that is because it builds community, gives people purpose, and offers answers to really difficult questions and important questions. And so I don't think it needs to be couched within one particular religion. What it needs to do is we need to have a society which answers those questions as truthfully as we possibly can, and in ways that help people live a good life. That's my rant from what you just said.
You sound nothing like Sam Harris.
I have an observation to make that I guess this is something that I've come to the conclusion of fairly recently, which is that when you watch these YouTube videos by these atheist YouTubers, or even someone like Sam Harris, is that really it seems like their criticism of Christianity, maybe Sam Harris's criticism of Christianity goes beyond just what I'm talking about, but it seems like what is fashionable in the atheist YouTube community is to find the young Earth creationist who really has very strict views of, a very literal interpretation of the Bible, very restrictive roles for women, and it really kind of not quite the Westboro Baptist Church view of Christianity, but a subset of the Christian community. Yeah. And they'll throw a lot of their criticisms at them. But in recent times, I've started wondering, well, what would the criticism be of a mainline Christian church that supports gay marriage, that allows female pastors, et cetera, et cetera?
It's doing all the right stuff according to his book.
Right. Yeah, exactly. According to either the atheist YouTuber or Sam Harris or what have you. Now, granted, I understand Sam Harris would still say, there is some things that are wrong even with that church, but it does seem like, because it's been mentioned in this discussion that there's lots of different varieties of Christianity, at least in terms of how human beings actually see Christianity. But it seems like it's really one brand of Christianity that's really getting the criticism. And there's a lot of people, I'm sure, more moderate Christians that are sitting back going, hey, I'm not on the atheist side, and I'm not on the young Earth creationist side either, or the extreme Calvinist side, or whatever you want to say about that. Yeah. And they're kind of like, I don't agree with either side of this. And maybe our discussion about religion needs to be more nuanced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I'm a Sam Harris fan, so I'm going to defend him. I think that I do find his arguments nuanced. Maybe that's unfair because I'm not from the other side again, so I'm not the one receiving the criticisms. So it's difficult for me to. I'm not standing where you're standing, right? So I think it's going to change. It's going to completely change my perspective. I hear him say, look, without these religious structures, I worry what will happen if we don't have that moral compass. That's one of the reasons why he wrote the moral landscape in the first place, because of his worry, the fact that religion provides that. So I think he actually does give a lot. And I find that when he discusses things with Ben Shapiro, like, he doesn't cower from discussing things with people who are considered powerful, worthy opponents of that particular branch of philosophy and religion. So I don't think that he goes for the small fries or the easy stuff. I think he has spent a considerable amount of time discussing it with the people who are quote unquote worthy opponents. But I actually don't find that part of Sam Harris that interesting. I find the part of Sam Harris much more interesting when it's just couched in much broader philosophical terms of how do we live a good life? What kind of habits should we develop? How should we think about one another? So I love his Waking Up app and his lessons on there and the meditations that you can do on there. I love his talks about neuroscience and being compassionate and how do we live in a better world. I love his conversation with Frank Ossieski. He's like one of my intellectual heroes about what death can teach us about living and how we approach impermanence and how we think about the impermanence of our everyday and our lives and our identities and ourselves. So all that really good, juicy, practical stuff, that's what I really like about him. And I suppose he's fighting back against Christianity a lot in some of his previous works and in loads of it, in kind of a decade-long kind of bouts on YouTube that you can look up with Hitchens and the other Horsemen. But I don't find that stuff that interesting, because I find that I think it actually may lead back to your point, Matthew, which is that it's quite combative, and it's not particularly, doesn't lead anywhere. It's not answering questions that I want to be answered. It's not actually answering the questions about living a good life. What it is doing is boo-hooing over there about a philosophy that he doesn't think, or I don't think is particularly helpful. But I think I've said my bit.
Well, Mark, I feel like I've let you down. I feel like I was like, oh man, Sam Harris drives me crazy, but I'm not giving any arguments. I'm just saying I really don't like his approach. Mark and Harry's just going, yeah, it's problematic at times.
No, that's okay. You can be honest if you're not as anti-Sam Harris as you thought you were. Maybe that's okay. But I mean, I have a little bit of a criticism of Sam Harris that I'll offer up right now, and it's not so much on the religion side, although I suppose I could maybe find a quibble here or there. But when he segues into politics, sometimes he sometimes makes it sound like, well, the only people who would disagree with me are people who, are just reading from an ancient text, or something like that. And I feel like, well, wait a minute, if you're going to make the case that we need to be rational, about the way we reach our conclusions, then you can't just skip all these steps and reach this view on this political viewpoint without really taking on all of the all the discordant viewpoints and why people have those different views.
Yeah, I think Paul Bloom softens him. I don't know whether you've listened to any of his. So recently, he started to have Paul Bloom on as a constant guest. I think let me just look it up. I think he's a professor at Yale. I'll just real quickly find this, just so I can be right about it. I thought it was Yale.
Yeah, it's Yale.
And he does lots of ethics stuff and does social science. And I find that he brings out the nice side of Sam Harris. Have you ever listened to a podcast where he's done with his wife, Annaka Harris? No. Really lovely. She wrote an amazing book, Consciousness, or maybe even just Conscious, something like that. Really lovely book. And the way he laughs in it and kind of has this like really, it's just full of playfulness. And when he has those guests, that's the side of him I enjoyed the most, when he's the least combative, and not when he's ranting about Trump, but instead when he's again talking about kind of the good things that I want to hear from him. And I consider him like one of kind of an intellectual leader in my life that I look up to, and I would prefer, particularly because I'm in the UK, right? So Trump doesn't interest me as much as if I was in the US, but I prefer it when he talks in broader terms. And I think, Matthew, there's a really important point that keeps coming up in my head about the fact that you have this amazing structure and community in your life that I'm very jealous of. That's something I don't have, and I think it would make my life better if I was to have that. And I'm even thinking about becoming a humanist chaplain and trying to create that community myself in a particular place, and trying to think about how a secular version of that would work, and how I could think about trying to bring that to others and bring that to myself, that spiritual guidance and understanding. I know spirituality is one of those words that is molded in so many ways. But I'm very jealous of that structure. And I do think it makes people's lives better, having that structure and having that support.
Yeah, I got a atheist friend of mine became a Buddhist monk.
There you go.
I'm impressed by that. I was emailing him and it came back. Sorry, I'm in a retreat for the next 3 months. So he's going to come out of his retreat and go, coronavirus? What's going on?
I'm starting to go on those retreats, like those meditative retreats and stuff. I love that kind of stuff, and we have a real yearning and curiosity to do that. I think we always have, from polytheism and way in the past, Neanderthals and things like that. So we've got that drive in us to try and understand what's around us. And I want to find the best methods of doing that and use those methods. I want to find the ones that are going to best elevate my life and the lives of others. I want to learn how to, have compassionate love for myself and for others. I want to learn how to be present. I want to learn how to kind of shake off the shackles of the inner voice and the kind of the nihilistic perspective. And I think it can be found in many different places. I don't think it has to be found in one particular religion. And I think that if we're talking about structuring societies in an effective way, we need this strain, right? This strain seems to be a really important part of it. There's some kind of religious or spiritual strain of a society. It seems to really bolster people's happiness and well-being, and I think is essential. So if we were to take religion away, something needs to fill that void, those questions, those ideas, that community.
And I have a question for John and Matthew here.
Okay.
Do you feel that when, say, an atheist YouTuber, gets Ken Ham, does videos on Ken Ham or Ray Comfort or somebody like that, do you feel that in some sense they are straw manning Christianity, finding it an easy target and kind of in some sense misrepresenting Christianity in some way, or do you not feel that way?
I think that there is something innately difficult about addressing a person with a different paradigm than your own. And because of that, there's almost an inherent straw manning that happens anytime I'm trying to talk at one of those groups instead of interacting with them and drawing out commonality.
I find that I don't know if I'm like frustrated with the fact that they're like straw manning or anything like that. I just like question the utility in doing those types of videos, because like if they're making the video in order to like convert the other person away from their more ridiculous understandings of or within their religion, then the way they go about it is like quite. I don't know how effective it would really be, because it seems to me that a lot of these types of videos aren't made for the people that the video is responding to. It's rather for the atheistic audience that's already there. And in a way that like it's almost, I don't want to overstate this exactly, but it's a form of pointing and laughing, I think. It's not that crass exactly. I understand like For the people that were raised in those types of very fundamentalist religions and then got out of it and found a relief from getting out of it, I think there is sort of a bit of therapeutic response that can be had through a bit of pointing and laughing, maybe. I'm not gonna like be the harsh moralist or anything like that. They're welcome to do that. I just think that there are more effective ways of reaching the other people than making these types of YouTube videos of like, I'm gonna pause it every 5 seconds and like, no, I don't believe that. I'm gonna debunk this or whatever.
The kind of analogy I try to draw out is, once upon a time when there was somebody over there who didn't agree with you, when you went and killed them, and then they were gone, and you didn't have to think about them anymore. But nowadays, when you win the argument, the people that you won against don't go away. So if you were trying to improve the world, if you were trying to change the world, you didn't actually succeed. I mean, unless I think there are instances where somebody who has an extremely high respect for rational, consistent arguments get given an argument from someone like Sam Harris. And a lot of the time, these are people, statistically speaking, from what I've seen at least, who are not actually that connected into their social networks in their religion. And they hear this argument, and they're very respectful of that argument, and then they go, he's right, and they do deconvert. But for the most part, he's throwing volleys at people who are very interconnected in a social sphere that they would absolutely hate to lose. And not only that, but it gives them meaning, it gives them purpose, it gives them drives, it gives them security. It's a volley against these people, and all they're doing is creating a greater connection between those people, actually, between the people that he's apparently not wanting them to connect to. So it's a strange behavior to me that has confused me. The whole new atheist movement of, okay, let's stop being nice, let's be mean now. I'm not sure why that was a good idea.
No, it's not. Have you read How to Have Impossible Conversations?
I'm about a third of the way through.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I love Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, and obviously a manual for creating atheists before that. But it doesn't have to be related to religion. It's just related to whatever topic that you're discussing. And I find they just the way they lay the land out in terms of having good conversations. It's just perfect. It is a really good guide, and it's split that way. For those who don't know, it's kind of the chapters are laid out so you can open up in any part of the book just to have a look at a particular lesson. So it's a textbook basically. You don't have to read it from front to back, although the difficulty increases as you go through the book in terms of the skill level required to employ some of those conversational techniques. But I love doing street epistemology. I love having those conversations. If I want to get to the bare bones of why someone believes in something and whether I can convince them otherwise, because I think that the facts that they're holding are not true facts and they don't actually follow with the evidence that we have, then that's the approach I'd rather have, because I find that it's just a better way of having a conversation. I listen more. I'm so bad at listening. I'm forced to listen more. I'm forced to consider their side much more. And I also know I could come to a point in the conversation where I actually find out the person just doesn't want to give it up. There's going to be no evidence that I can present to them that's going to change their mind. And then I can drop the conversation. But if I'd never done that work before, then I'm going to be throwing stuff at them. I might even be getting angry at them. So it really does change. I think having an idea of what a good conversation looks like and having those tools in the bag to make sure that it doesn't derail and comes to people just flinging crap at each other. I think, I agree. It's really important to have that in the back. And I don't understand. I agree. I don't understand why. And kind of there's a movement that the movement decided to go more aggressive. The kind of this Hitchens kind of like perspective of and there's a wonderful flair in kind of how verbose he may be and kind of how complex his language is and the way he uses it. But actually, whether it convinces people or not, like I don't think it is particularly convincing for people on the other side. They just feel like they're being criticized, and their gatehouse just goes up, and they're like, no, they want to, right. They just want to swear back at him.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've discovered that we all kind of agree on these things, is there any disagreements we want to try to handle?
I will say that I do appreciate Sam Harris, and I think that he sort of stands above the rest of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse or whatever, because he is very much interested in a lot of broad topics and he's willing to sort of go into them. It's not like he has just kind of this one thing about him. He's very interested in a lot of different things that anybody can really appreciate and be able to sort of like gain from listening to him and his podcast. So was it Making Sense Now instead of Waking Up? It is. He's got a lot of great episodes on there.
He does have lots of great episodes, and I really like him as someone who kind of to guide me through some of those slightly trickier waters.
Well, let me ask one kind of a follow-up question to this, to my previous question. Let's say you you have some friends who are in what you consider to be a harmful religion. So what is the best method of trying to get them out of there? I mean, yeah, I'll just
street epistemology. Love. So a connection first, and then you build the emotional connection, and then you make it so that they can physically transition. Because I suspect if it's if it's something that is particularly bad, then you have to be careful about taking them out of that particular place. It reminded me. Have you guys read Educated by Tara Westover? It was it last year it came out? Maybe I'll find it. Anyway, she grew up in basically a kind of a cult family, had a pretty horrendous, violent upbringing, and then she managed to escape and actually ended up at Cambridge University in the UK, and then she got a PhD. And so it's a wonderful story about that journey that she has. But it's a perfect example of how someone can break free of that and what is required for that to be the case. And often it's several good actors who offer a hand and are prepared to be there again and again until the person can sort themselves out. Mark, you read the book is it Megan?
Yeah, Megan Phillips Roper. I read her book on leaving the Westboro Baptist Church. Ultimately what got her out of that church was when she was on Twitter. And she was the kind of the spokesperson for the church on Twitter, and all of her Twitter interactions were really what ultimately pulled her out. And although I do think the fact that she was of that generation, when I read the book, I realized that generation was into pop music and everything, and she was even though she was very a conservative Christian, she was familiar with all the modern pop music and everything. And it just seemed like ultimately that her peers drew her out.
Wasn't it Twitter? Wasn't it a guy off Twitter?
Yeah. And she fell in love with a guy that she met on Twitter and ended up marrying him. Still,
the beauty of social media. Who would have thought that Twitter is something that would bring people together?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the thing is like you have to approach the other person in a spirit of love and being able to like actually try to understand what they're sort of getting out of their religion and see like if that's something that's helpful to them, and also just being able to befriend them. These sorts of things, like you can't just win them over the course of a conversation, I don't think. I mean, I guess there are certain street epistemology cases where that does actually sort of happen, or at least it sort of sets a sort of question in the other person to the point that they do end up deconverting. But I think by being there for them and being able to like interact with them, and I think a lot of times people in bad situations remain there because they think that that's the only option available to them. And so when they're provided with other instances of people that aren't in those same types of situations, but still being able to like get all the basic necessities to life and all the things that they seek after, then that sort of provides a bit of evidence that they can sort of be a little bit more open to new ideas. And I think that sort of thing can't just be happened in an instant. That's something that you have to gradually sort of come to realize about the other person. Because that's the thing, like, I'm just somebody in a little box on the internet. There's a whole lot of elements to my life that you don't know about. And I'm sure there's tons of elements to your life that I don't know.
I'm just a robot. I'm actually AI. There's nothing behind me.
You have no legs. Yeah. And there's, in order to actually come to fully understand that the person that you're interacting with is genuine and authentic, you have to have some sort of real connection there that you get from a true friendship.
You have to be playful. I think there's a dynamic here, which is that there's a relationship to be had. In the book that we just read for the book club that Mark has on his Discord, it's kind of 5 invitations, if you like, from what we could learn from our impermanence and death. And one of them is cultivate a don't know mind. And the perspective is that, look, who's to you say that you even know? It's okay just to sit back and just to observe and just to be, and you can just be with that particular person, even if you disagree with them. And and it's also kind of the Zen Buddhist idea of beginner's mind as well, where you're open to ideas and concepts rather than being closed-minded. And sometimes, I know I do this. I feel I'm so certain that I immediately jump to that certainty rather than just letting things breathe a little and kind of, again, doing the SE thing of trying to understand where that person is coming from. And I don't see the objective of street epistemology as converting people. I see the main objective of street epistemology is to understand where someone is coming from. Whether you choose to then try and push your own worldview or get them to question their confidence in a way that undermines it, that's an option to be had. But the main thing is you're testing to see where their confidence comes from, why they are so confident, and what would move their confidence. Mm-hmm. And then from that, you can then try and move that needle if you want to. But the most important part of it, the very core kind of Magna Bosco thing, is just to understand where the person's at.
Well, that's good. I do remember there was one point in How to Have an Impossible Conversation that made me kind of go, now what is he intending there? And he was talking about every now and then he tries to dissuade a fan of a certain team not to be the fan of that. And he's like, I just want to see if I can do it. And I'm just like, what? That sounds like you're like trying to toy with his life there. I mean, that could be a really big part of how he lives his life. And you're just, let's see if I can pop that sucker loose there. And I'm just like, what
does this do?
Yeah, what does this do? Let's see what happens if I yank this out. But it sounds like you're saying that's not the goal necessarily. The goal is to understand why they're so committed to it.
Yes.
That's much, I like that. That's good.
I would say with the team thing, although I need to reread it, my understanding of that example was all about how that's of the intermediate level, I think. And that's where people are committed for a moral reason or reason because they think it's good. So that they're not using rationality, but because it feels good to be part of that group. Mm. And obviously feelings don't indicate truth. So it's one of those, he's trying to say, how do you approach this particular situation? That was my understanding of that part of the book, but it's been a while since I've read it.
Well, that's interesting because then it almost becomes, I mean, if that is the case, if the only reason somebody's a huge fan of a team, like they've got their colors flying and in posters everywhere, is because it embeds them in this social milieu, then it's like, that's kind of an interesting thing too, because it's almost like this leap of faith in this team because of the social, my words are failing me, because the benefits, the social benefits it gives you. That's interesting. Honestly, I'm not the kind of person that's highly motivated by social circles. So that kind of thing is always very curious to me. I mean, I'm glad I have a community, but the times I haven't had that community, I've been like, well, it's me and you, God, let's go. You know.
Who needs other people when you got a relationship with a superior being, right?
The Almighty, for goodness sakes.
People are crap anyway. I bet someone who's all loving and all knowing is going to be way better as a partner.
So we've been at it 52 minutes. I don't know when you need to go, but something did pop into my mind that I'm very interested in, which is the moral objective morality or moral realism. Oh shoot, how do I frame this? I suppose this simply goes back to the arguments I've already been making about being aware of where the other person is coming from before you start launching arguments.
Yeah.
Because John Bug is familiar with this argument because I've been around in circles with Pleasure of Doubt over this. But it is bizarre to me sometimes that there is an attempt by moral realists to shoot down something like free will and say it doesn't even exist, as opposed to move the goalposts. I don't know if they think that's dishonest or what it is, but it seems like what they should be trying to do is find common ground. So specifically what I'm referring to is I have let go of an idea of libertarian free will as something that I don't know that I can make sense of. But free will certainly seems to describe the fact that I am the person, even if I'm not fully conscious of all the reasons I'm making decisions, I do have the capacity to change what my goals are, or at least my conscious awareness appears to be participating in the process of changing my goals. And when I change my goals, it changes. I am responsible, if you will, for having changed my goals. And so I have a real hard time understanding why someone would try to make an argument against free will when it has such explanatory social power, and yet they don't seem to give a very good replacement. In fact, when I was just rereading Sam Harris's book on free will again, I noticed he said, we may not even be able to stop using the term free will. And I'm just like, what? Are you, what? Huh? So I don't understand the move. That,
right.
Can you explain that better? Like,
I
why?
can from my perspective. I know that Mark, for instance, is a compatibilist, and several other people are in this. And the reason why they make that distinction is because it seems to just, because that language seems to be necessary in order to just, there's a there that is an important part of the conversation and the narrative. I mean, I disagree. I just think we need to use better words. We haven't got the right words for it. And I think there's a way around that. The reason why you'd want it to change is because it completely switches the idea of moral responsibility, and it gets us to think more broadly about why people make the choices that they make. So for me, it means I'm more I'm kinder to people and myself. That's what I find from it. That's the main benefit.
When you consider that they're not responsible for their own actions.
So responsibility is a tricky one. This is why I think the language that we've got is something that is not particularly helpful. But put it this way, the reason why someone committed a murder is because there's a whole load of stuff leading up to that, and then they committed the murder. Their genetics and their environment, both are things they don't control when they grow up, and then it's just all dominoes from there. So in my head, the varying degrees of moral luck about where I've ended up and how my brain calculates things, and so I'm just much more aware. So I know that I witness my calculation. That's what free will feels like, but it doesn't mean that if all the parameters were the same, I wouldn't make the same decision again, because I would, because I'm a physical system. I'm not a dualist, so I don't believe in a soul, and I don't believe in a God. So for me, we are just a physical system, and an incredible, awesome system with lots of values and feelings and experience. So when we say we are just atoms, I think that's really silly. We're not just atoms. We have a conscious experience that is incredibly important. Because we can feel pleasure and pain. That's why it's important. And because we can have varying degrees of contentedness and varying degrees of doubt and pain and suffering, and all, we've got that whole plethora in front of us. That's why it's important. But determinism specifically makes me think about how I make decisions and why other people also make decisions. And so when I think about moral responsibility, what I end up doing is thinking about, okay, how can we prevent a certain action from happening that reduces the overall suffering? So I think less about how to incite retribution or whatever. I think of people like a physical system, like how I'd avoid a hurricane is very much how I want to avoid a murderer, and how I'd want to avoid a bear. All these things are put into the same category of kind of avoidance and trying to change my interactions with those particular things so that the level of suffering is reduced. So I find that I drop some of the preconceptions I may have and some of the judgments I may have because I try and take into account the idea of moral luck. Obviously, it doesn't always work. I'm human, but that's why I find that I try and get from determinism and moral realism being together.
Okay, so there's something about that I didn't catch. So you're saying that you do not use the term free will because you're trying to look at something like the whole range of possible ways a person has made a decision?
So I think free will implies that the person could have done otherwise. And that's my issue with it. Because as far as I understand the laws of the universe, which is not very well because I'm not a physicist, but they seem to be very consistent. And we seem to be physical systems. So we couldn't have done otherwise because that's the way that we're arranged. I'm happy to be corrected on that if there's evidence that we could have done. But that's what I don't like about the term free will, because it implies that, I could have gone to the gym this evening, but I didn't. Actually, the reality of it is that I would have never, you repeat this universe again and again and again with the same replication. I would have never have gone to the gym on this particular night, just because my brain was set up in a certain way. I ate certain food earlier. I had a discussion with someone certainly other, and I had a feeling. So the way I see it is that free will is unhelpful because it adds a layer of I could have done otherwise, which I don't think is true.
There's a sense in which I can't disagree with you, because you are who you were in that moment. And so you would have chosen that because that's who you were. You were the person who chose what you did. You can't magically be a different person who would have chosen something else. And so there's a sense in which I agree with that, but there's something to be said for, so for me, being aware that I could have chosen otherwise, meaning I have that faculty. I have a faculty of choosing, and that faculty could have been used for another option, because I'm constantly forecasting future events and trying to decide which path is better. Yeah. And if it's true that in that instant, in that past moment, I was the one who chose, path A instead of B or C, but I had the faculty to choose one of the others. I just didn't because of who I was in that moment. So those are,
okay.
It's important, I think, to note that the faculty of choice exists and not lose that. And so I guess maybe what the conversation has to be is what do we mean by free? What is the range of possibilities that we're talking about?
Right.
And because to simply say you can't have chosen otherwise is like, dude, I had the choice faculty. You're talking nonsense.
Yeah. So there's two distinct things here. If we were to repeat the scenario, would you make the same decision again? And does your brain have the capacity to calculate a different answer if I was to give it to different inputs? Those are two slightly different things. So the way I think about choice is I think about calculation. We witness the calculation we make, but it is a calculation, and all those variables can change depending on our environment and our genetics. So if we consider that as choice in terms of we could have chosen otherwise if you were to give it different inputs, then yeah, of course. And so that's really the way I see it, is that if we were to repeat the scenario again, I would always have you seen Westworld at all?
I haven't had an opportunity.
No. The modern one's very good.
It looks interesting, yeah.
The first season very good. Lots of really cool philosophy in it, including stuff about free will. And they have this specific room where they get this robot. It is a robot. You learn it's a robot at the very beginning of the episode. And it's doing the same thing again and again and again. And you're like, why is it doing the same thing again and again? And you realize they just create the scenario the same way. So all the inputs are exactly the same, and it acts the same way. And it has the supposedly as complex faculties as human beings are supposed to be, or what.
Well, does it have no past memory? Is it memory?
Yeah, so they erase the memory and it just wakes up.
Gotcha.
And then all the sensory information gets it to act the same way again and again and again and again. So they're doing replicates just to see how if you adjust things more and more, how it changes its how it changes its reaction. And that's really the way I see it. So it will witness its own calculation in its head, but it will always choose the same. The answer will always be X if all the inputs are the same. It's just an equation that we spit out. And I think that we have even kind of empirical evidence of this. We know, for instance, that I love the work of Derren Brown, for instance, when he tricks people into making certain decisions or thinking certain things. And we know we're incredibly fallible, and it's easy to actually manipulate us to come up with certain conclusions or feel certain ways. And we even know this at a societal level. If we introduce certain laws, we know that changes behavior towards one thing and another. That's because we are natural systems that are affected by our environment and affected by our genetics. And so this distinction, when people use the word free will, what I think that you're saying, okay, you could have chosen differently. In that scenario, you couldn't have, but maybe if we change your environment, you would have calculated a different output. You would have done something differently because there is something in that room, in that particular place, in that particular time, that's going to make you as a system react differently to it. And that's also the way I see how we think about moral responsibilities, whether we can reduce suffering and what kind of inputs are going to affect that particular agent. And I don't actually see way people talk about moral agency. I don't even think is that helpful. I think it's much more helpful just to think about what inputs are going to reduce suffering, because a bear might not have moral agency, but it still causes suffering. So we need to think about ways in which we can stop that bear from mauling other people and getting shot, or whatever it may be.
See, the thing that I don't know, it seems to me that morality is very much closely tied to our notion of like being able to set the goals that we work on. But it seems to me that if determinism is true, there's always like a unsettable goal within every single human being that may not be the same, or maybe, I don't know, it's very kind of, maybe we're just genetically replicating machines, something like that. That's the goal. That's inset within
it
all
is,
of us.
yeah. We just replicate DNA. All this complexity, the only reason it exists is so that DNA can continue being DNA.
And so is the goal set of Sam Harris's morality in line with the deterministic facts of nature that, like Sam Harris is trying to tell us that we should minimize the amount of suffering that's occurring in the world. But it is the case that all we're going to be able to be doing is to maximize the amount of genetic organisms that share our code out there in the universe.
That's not a good goal to have, though. So I'd say that. So I mean, in terms of maybe I need to explain that a bit more. So we've been given a certain goal. By the reason why it exists is because of this, because of the intrinsic possibles of the physical universe. But from that, we've realised that we now have conscious experience, and that is more important because it is conscious experience by its very nature.
Right. So the preloaded goal set within us as Darwinistic machines, is malleable in a sense, I guess, through the interaction of memes with each other. Which
and thank God, right? Because if it wasn't, it would be a hellscape.
No, thank God.
We'd be stuck to our. Thank God if we just had a limbic system, then it would be a really painful existence. We'd be like other animals of the animal kingdom, going through these high states of low and going from high to low all the time, constantly not knowing. Like you'd be a dog at the door, scratching, not knowing what's going on. So you go through these conscious, anxious periods. But we developed a reasoning faculty, and now all of a sudden we seem to be able to have logic and rationality, and we can actually assign better goals and better experiences.
I think the analogy to robots somewhat isn't quite complete, because with robots, that you set the goal for what the robot's going to do, and then that gives it the faculty to calculate what it will do. Whereas with humans, if the goal set is something malleable to the point that, like, I can convince you of the case that, hey, you should become a vegan or something like that, you'll change your goal sets that you have so that you're no longer going to be eating meat. These are aspects to us that are sort of different from robots. I think, at least.
For now, we'll see how they develop AI, and all it takes is intelligence. So you increase the bandwidth of calculation and understanding and drawing lines between things, and then it will have a more complex response to what's going on, and it may even be able to rationalize and come up with different answers about things. And in Westworld, in that particular imaginative scenario, they do. So a lot of them have kind of pre-tracked minds, and the series is basically set off that one of the robots may have developed some kind of general AI, which is going to cause it to go off kind of its railroad tracks of being part of a theme park. And so that it's a really
to rebel against its programming.
Right, to use kind of its cognitive faculties, and it's really lovely. I think it's quite violent, lots of sex in it. So if you're not into that kind of stuff, then don't watch it. But it's got lots of really good. I really like the philosophy in it and the ideas. I think it's a good. I know that there's an very old one. I'm talking about the newer one. Second season.
I think it's based off of a book by Michael Crichton too. He did Jurassic Park, so he had sort of a couple of books in that same sort of fashion. Yeah, I love those types of science fiction type shows like that. So I've had people recommending it to me for a while, but there's so many shows and stuff out there that it's hard to.
I always plow through them. That's how I waste my time. I love that kind of. I love those kind of philosophical story driven things that just catnip to me. And so yeah, that's how that's when I'm not reading, I'm staring at a screen. So it's all this focal. Like they're going to need glasses at some point.
So I did want to return one more time to free will and could not have chosen otherwise, that kind of thing. So your response to, but I have the faculty to choose, seemed to be, we could change its environment and it might come up with a different solution. And that was strange to me, because to me, the most significant thing that changes is my observation of what happens when I make a choice. The definition of, it's the AA thing. The definition of insanity is you do the same thing and you expect different results. Well, when you're a conscious, I guess a part of what I would say is free will is contingent upon is how self-aware you are capable of becoming. The more self-aware you're capable of becoming, the more you're capable of modeling who you want to be in the future.
Yeah.
And so that all seems to make sense to me under the term free will, because I'm modeling myself, and then I'm looking at myself, and I'm looking at my expectations of what I want out of life, and I'm saying, okay, how can I tweak my goal sets to become who I want to do? I mean, I have to recognize what reality is out there and, influence it the way I can. But the most significant thing seems to be happening for what I would consider, maybe you could call it maximal free will, something like, okay, somebody with minimal free will simply makes a choice, but they're very controlled by their environment. They're not in the process of discovering themselves and modifying who they want to be.
Right. Yeah.
But a person who does have that, I mean, what terminology would you prefer to use, if not free will, to describe that kind of thing?
Oh, I don't know. Someone cleverer than me needs to come up with that. So two really good points I think that you touched on there. One is, I'm modeling my environment, and that's important. And I would say, what's causing you to model your environment? Your environment, what's happened just now previously. So it's all leading up to that. So you think about something because something has led up to that. And that's the whole charade of this conscious experience. It's crazy to think of, I know. But when we sit down and thinking about something, no matter how long I think about that, I'm going to come up with the same answer if all my inputs are the same. Because that line of questioning has all been preloaded by my past experiences.
So is it because you can make that scenario, that hypothetical scenario of kind of replaying that moment in time, is that alone why you feel like it's good to get rid of the term free will?
So and I could be well wrong in this. Like maybe free will is necessary for a discussion. It just needs to be redefined. So the distinction here is, how can we change people? Can people change their minds according to their environment? That's the most important thing here. And so when I say people have choice, what they're saying is that they could have done otherwise if we changed their environment in some way. And that's the way I see it. And when you say, oh, they didn't have as much choice, all you've done there is you just identified, we know more of the parameters that's affecting their decision. So there are certain inputs that we want to remove. We want to remove certain authorities and violence because we know that forces people down a path that makes them calculate a certain way, which causes unrest and unhappiness. So I just think of it as
like to say that somebody has more or less choice is just to say that we have a better awareness of like what the factors were that led to them making a choice.
Correct. Yeah.
But it like the term otherwise, like within determinism, doesn't make much sense, because like there's no thing in which you have a more or less choice, because you have no choice at all. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. But colloquially, when we use choice, what we're saying is that person was free of certain inputs. That's the way I kind of see it in my head. So when you say I have the choice to choose what university I go to, what we're saying is that me as an individual, I'm free of certain inputs, like parents forcing me to pick a particular one because of the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're saying is we're free of certain inputs within that calculation, but it's still a calculation. So it's not choice in the free will sense that there's choice. It's just free of certain variables within the equation, or those variables are zero.
I still think we need the words free will.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm proving it right now. It's making no sense.
I know some people use the term autonomy instead, but it seems to me they're just using it as a replacement for free will. So I don't know. It's at least it maybe doesn't have that same sort of metaphysical baggage that a lot of people get from free will.
Let me toss this one out. Oh, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was just going to say that I often find myself, and of course this is my bias talking and I'm aware of it, but it's hard for me to know how to get around that bias and figure out what I should be thinking of without that bias. But I find myself going, okay, you're arguing against free will because you know that is a part of my theology. And so you're interested in breaking that part so that all the rest of my carefully constructed theology it falls apart. So you're biased, haha. I don't have to listen to you. So, but I want to get around that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to say that you've talked about, yes, there's a freedom in the sense that I'm free from pressures, or I'm free from external things, kind of trying to force me. I'm not free from myself, if you will. And yet I am free to model myself. I have that capacity to model myself and figure out how to model myself and my environment in the future. And so there are freedoms. We are definitely agreeing that there are freedoms we have because we have those capacities.
Yeah. And so again, when I think about it, I'm thinking about when we talk about freedoms, what we're talking about is we're free from certain inputs and variables. So the fact that I can project forward and have a theory of mind is fantastic. And that changes the way I calculate what's happening. But all those projections and why I'm projecting in the first place is all caused by what just happened, is all caused by the stuff that's happening around me. So when I sit back in my chair and I'm imagining a scenario, the reason I can imagine that scenario is because of all the other points that led me there in the first place. So I don't actually have any.
So you're saying you don't like the idea of freedom to, you agree with freedom from, but you don't agree with freedom to. Would that be accurate?
I don't think I understood. Well, I don't think I understood that point you made.
Well, freedom to is, in my mind at least, to have the capacity to have the capacity. And so to have the freedom to is to have the capacity to, model my future self and make choices that will allow me to reach that goal or get closer to it.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be the kind of freedom we have. We have a freedom from, hopefully, a freedom from people trying to, enslave us.
Yes.
And then freedom to engage in this self-development process so that I can become maximally myself.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah. So do you not like calling that freedom?
I guess I do like calling that freedom. So maybe that makes free will make more sense as a term. So so I'd say that. So let's couch it in animal welfare, for instance.
Okay.
So we say we want to have animals freedom from certain pain and freedom to express. I think we have maybe it's the 4 freedoms, or our ethics system is based off lots of freedom from certain things, and then a freedom to express natural behavior.
Okay.
And so what we're saying is that they are allowed the capacity to do that. They are free from certain inputs in order for them to do that. And maybe it does make more sense, like you said, to have that freedom term in there. For me, it makes sense to have that freedom term in there. And it's only a short step to then say they have the free will from certain things. I'm agnostic about how effective free will is as a term. I do notice, though, that when people use it, they're often saying, I could have gone to the gym tonight. I should have chosen otherwise. And I find that you couldn't have chosen otherwise with all the inputs that were there. So just think about the inputs that happened that meant, why you didn't go to the gym.
Maybe can you unpack what you mean by inputs then? Because I'm seeing it not as, when I hear inputs, I'm hearing external inputs.
Right.
But the inputs that seem to matter are the ones that are happening within our own experience.
Right. Yeah. So I think if it's one big equation, and then you get kind of an outcome at the end, and so how that equation is calculated has lots of different variables, and those variables include our biology, so the kind of synapses and how we view and interpret the world, and then what's interacting with those with our sense making apparatus, and then that will spit out an answer to what's happening. So that's what the inputs is both. The input from ourselves, so how we interpret the sensory input data, so our genetics, if you like, and it's also, how bright the room is and what am I smelling and what am I seeing.
Let me try it this way. So when let's say I should have gone to the gym today and I failed to go to the gym. So there was something in me that was not committed enough to that goal. Right. And then I say, I should have gone. Why didn't I go? And hopefully I will introspect to such a degree that I will discover why I didn't and take steps to ensure that next time that calculation comes out, go to the gym is accomplished, that kind of thing. So I'm still, when I describe that, I'm still believe I'm describing free will. Because I'm describing my failure. Okay, why did I fail? There was a failure in me that made me not choose that. So how can I upgrade myself to choose that? Because it's almost like you're looking at the one moment in time and saying, okay, I'm not seeing free will, but I'm saying, but it happens over and over. It's a cyclical process. And when you look at the whole cyclical process, then you see where the freedom emerges, because it's not like I never get to the gym. I'm not capable of remodeling my internal circuitry so that I finally get myself to the gym. Yeah. No, I appear to be able to do that. It just takes some time. It doesn't happen in a minute, in that second, but it does happen over time. And therein lies the freedom.
It sounds like you have more information. You have more information after the fact than you did before the fact. Mm-hmm. After the fact, you can look back on what prevented you from going to the gym. And you didn't have access to that information at the time, but later you can look back and go, "Oh, you know what? I just wasn't, I wasn't organized enough at work, and therefore I didn't make it to the gym." So I think a lot of times that's what
I'm hungry. That's a big one for me.
You got hungry or whatever, yeah. But it sounds like when we look back on something we did or didn't do, and we think of it in terms of a free will, like, I could have done otherwise. But I think implicit in that is we now have access to a little more information than we had back then. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. I think that's right.
Yeah. And so I see the way you're using free will is the possibility of choice, in the sense that it was possible for me, so in my terms, to calculate the outcome of me going to the gym. Mm-hmm. So what happened there? How do I break that situation down to figure out the variables that need to be changed next time? Mm-hmm. Of course, in my world, that would all would happen. So all that post calculation is bound to happen. So if we get our sim again and put them in a room and we fiddle with the variables enough so that they don't go to the gym, we're also going to predict with certainty that then they're going to worry about why they haven't gone to the gym, and then they're going to come up with certain conclusions, because it's all one path following.
Do you recognize the difference between like passive use of words and like active use of words, where like it seems like when we frame things from a purely deterministic sense, we're framing everything in the sort of passive sense, like these things happen to me and therefore I do this, and then there's the other way in which to sort of frame it, that like these things happened and then I chose to do this, or I don't know the exact.
I'm terrible at active and passive voice. I always get corrected to try and put things in active voice, and I'm like, I don't know how to do this, and I rephrase the sentence. I'm like, it'll like that, and it says it's passive again. So
I'm not too sure on it either, but it's I don't know. At least for me, the thing that seems, and maybe you'll be able to like lower my confidence in this, that makes me think of free will. Yeah. Is there are occasions where using like that are okay. So like the example I sort of have that for free will occurring is where you're like listening to classical music or an orchestra where there are many different instruments, and then you have the strange ability, I have the strange ability, it seems, to sort of like focus my attention on one or the other instruments. And it's not a product of the external thing. It's not like the violin is suddenly getting louder and then that's what's making me hear it. And it's not like the cello is suddenly getting softer at the same time. It's rather my own intentionality through my own consciousness that's directing something that allows me to experience the world in a different way.
And
I don't know.
That's all part of the natural world. That's all part of our brains, right? So you've got something in there which says that all this. I don't know. Do you meditate at all, John?
I have a couple times. I need to do it more, really.
Okay, so I think that there's if you do it regularly enough, you can observe your pattern of thoughts. I bet that while you're listening to the music, there's a sentence that runs through your head that goes, "I wonder what the cello's doing now," and then you go through it. So you are processing the information, and there is kind of this gurgling up from the subconscious of this thing that's popping into your head, and that's why you're doing it. And it's because you're getting that sensory input, and so all your subconscious and your conscious systems are interacting, going, oh, what do we do with this input? And your conscious and subconscious systems, as far as I'm aware, are all part of our naturalistic world, so they obey the laws of physics and they follow cause and effect.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's hard to talk about these types of things because sometimes, like, if you try to use like a computer metaphor or something like that, it just kind of puts into this mindset of like, okay, there's an actual like line of code in the computer that like when on this certain date and instance where he's listening to an orchestra, he's going to elevate the hearing of the cello music at this point in time, and then it's like so much to that, and it's not like that.
There's a worry there. I think there's a worry, and maybe this is something that Matthew might talk about, or the way he sees maybe an atheistic perspective, is that there's a beauty that's lost from it. So the way unweaving the rainbow, kind of understanding, or not even understanding, but the way the terms that it's couched, atoms moving and atoms in motion, or whatever it may be. And it's like, that's not conscious experience, though. That's not what it feels like to be there. That's not the beauty or and so I'd take Sean Carroll's perspective of poetic naturalism, where all that beauty is an important and real part of the natural universe. We know it is. We are, if anything, that's the only thing we know, is that's definitely the case.
Yeah, and there's a sense in which that it is definitely like coherent. I think, but there's the other ways in which like some of these terms that we're using, but we're like couching it in a purely fictionalist sort of sense. Like if Sam Harris says you should minimize suffering in all your actions or something like that, he's using a sort of moral term with like the implication, at least generally how it's understood, that you can do this thing. You can minimize suffering through your actions.
Yes.
And which if determinism is true, if there's any instance in which I don't minimize suffering through my actions, then I could not have minimized suffering through my actions. And so the
comes from the manipulation of variable. Like, can we stop a bear from entering a town? Can a bear choose to can we make a bear fly? Right. So there's just degrees of difficulty in terms of the input. So when we say someone should do something, what we're saying is it is possible for us to create a system, or it is actually fairly easy for us to create a society or group or ethic that pushes people towards one thing rather than another. I mean, the way I see it is that as long as it's within the laws of physics, all possibilities are out there in terms of persuading people. So the should will get wider and wider.
Well, hold on. If determinism is true, the only possibilities that are out there are whichever possibilities become actualized. Like there's only one possibility, and then that's the one that we end up getting to.
There is only one true possibility, but we don't know what that possibility is. That's my understanding. I mean, maybe there's the case against reality with what's his face,
Donald Hoffman.
Thank you. Where actually,
that's a good episode. I need to listen to the longer version. I've only listened to the first part.
It's great when it's Annika and Sam and they're chatting. But I've started his book. I find it. I'm listening to an audio. I much prefer to listen when he's explaining it on podcasts. to people. But maybe, what I'm perceiving and how I'm understanding this kind of cause and effect thing is just completely wrong. Like it's the software on a computer and not the computer itself. So I'm thinking that the computer is kind of Microsoft when it's not at all. It's lots of wires, and so my perception of what reality is way off.
Yeah,
could be, again, agnostic.
Yeah, I think that's just kind of the sign of the times, I guess, that like whatever the major source, whatever the major sort of type of technology of whatever era you're living within, that's the same sort of analogy that you're going to use for the most complex thing of like our consciousness. Like I'm sure like during the time of Newton, when clocks were all the rage, everyone sort of thought of the Clockwork Man.
Yeah.
Now when we're within the computer age, I'm sure that's sort of
algorithms.
The analogy I'm guessing once like quantum computing goes up, that'll be the next sort of analogy that we use, and then from there be some other thing. It's
lots of use of trains when they were very popular being built.
The steam powered man. Yeah.
A lot of that stuff.
These like little levers and water like balances going on inside the head, and that's what's making me do one thing rather than another. Yeah.
So I have to head off now, really. So if there's any last things that you'd like to ask me, and I'm happy to come back on again, of course. But if there's anything that either John, Mark, or Matthew, I've just realised that's a very biblical set of names.
Sorry, what was that?
I said I just realised that's a very biblical set of names.
Yeah, we got to get a Luke in next.
Mark, Matthew, and John.
I spoil it a little.
Yeah. Matthew, Mark, Harry, and John.
Yeah. It was one of the ones that was discarded.
Yeah. I was wanting to run a model of consciousness by you real quick, but I don't know if you'll have time for that. So maybe we can try another time.
Let's try another time. Let's do it another time.
Yeah. This is fun, though.
That'll set up another.
This is a good conversation.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I'm glad you all joined me on this Sunday afternoon or evening, as it were. And I'll see you guys later.
See you later. Bye.
Oh, suddenly it's us too.
I feel bad that Mark didn't get to talk as much. He seems to like be very okay with like taking the backseat for these types of things.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that's kind of his personality, where he's very interested in making these kinds of conversations happen.
Mm. Well, I like his other, like he does like one-on-one interviews with people on his channel too. Are we still live?
Oh, we are still live. I guess we gotta get out of here. Okay. Bye, John.